Kia ora, everyone. Welcome. Kopri and wadia tōku ingoa. No tamaki makala hao. I am the founder and chairperson for NATINA, Neuroscience and Trauma-Informed Network Aotearoa. We're really, really excited today to have Dr. Dre with us for our monthly Korero. And I will get us going with a karakia, and we'll get going with a conversation. Depending on whether we've got some time at the end, we might open the floor to questions, but we're really excited to hear Dr. Dre today. So thank you for coming along. Really appreciate that. I'll begin us with our karakia. Karakia te matanga. Manakitia tēne hui, manakitia tēne rutu, manakitia tēne whānau. Tai noa ki tainei kaupapa. Arahina nā korero, arahina nā papai. Arahina nā ture nei, kia puta ai te maramatanga. So bless this meeting, bless this group, bless this family. We come together for this gathering. Guide the discussion, guide the questions, guide the intent, so that we can move on towards greater understanding. Amine. All right. Now, I'm just going to quickly introduce, because we've got a lot of new faces today. So I'm going to introduce who we are at NATINA. So NATINA is the Neuroscience and Trauma-Informed Network Aotearoa. We were established in February last year, and the purpose was to support and network and connect with people who are doing this fabulous mahi. When I first started out on this journey, I started out because of my personal lived experience of trauma through the discrimination that we experienced because of disability issues in the education and disability space, wider community space as well. So my purpose was to connect with others who are doing this mahi and make sure that our school communities become more trauma-informed. And over the years, I've connected with lots of individuals, and I found that there's actually so much happening at that individual grassroots level. And so we're hoping that we can connect, we can support each other, and we can look at how we can grow this kaupapa. The other thing is, so I'll just read out our vision. Our vision is to create inclusive, safe, trauma-aware schools and communities so that every akonga belongs, learns, and thrives. And we are really, really committed as a organization to uphold our obligations to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, uphold our obligations to the UNCRPD, which is the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, and the UNCRC, which is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. The other thing is we are committed to the Enabling Good Lives approach, which is a Aotearoa-based approach, supporting disabled people and making sure their voices are front and center. And most importantly, we are committed to protecting the mana of the child and making sure all our kids can thrive. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Andre McLachlan. Now, he comes from Ngāti Apa, is a clinical psychologist and addiction specialist. He is also a father to two children with fetal alcohol syndrome disorder. So Te Iho Tātai a Rongo. And he is a member of the Māori Coalition on FASD as well. So he works with Te Raora, and he delivers training on the Te Whare o Oro Māori framework model of neurodevelopment that guides the discussion on health and healthy understanding of the brain and our children's development. So really, really excited to have you here, Dr. Dre, and I would love for you to introduce yourself a bit more and tell us a little bit about yourself, both your personal and professional background, and the different spaces you've been, and what has led you to your journey, into this space more recently.
Kia ora.
On to you. Welcome.
Pai tēnā. Tēnā tātou. Tihu te wai ko wangaihu, ka kiti te wai ko mangawhero, ka hinga te rākau ko turakina, ka tīkei te oku wai ko rangi tīkei, ka pukana oku karu ki roto manua tū, ngā wai kaukau o ngā tūpuna, ngā wai hirongo o ngā kuia, tihei mauri ora. So they are my awa, so I'm from Ngā Waiariki Ngāti Apa, ahakoa I grew up in the Waikato and live in the Waikato. I have 6 children and they are my main job. Secondary to that, I work for Te Raupara Māori Workforce Development, WinTech on their postgrad programs, and a little bit of private practice to keep my brain sharp and my teaching relevant, I guess.
Amazing. Look, I heard about you first when actually another parent spoke about the Te Whare o Oro model and the training sort of you'd done for the parents from FASD. And so I was really intrigued and I was like, wow, this is amazing, because when we started up with NATINA, I was really struggling to understand how do we truly uphold what we've agreed to, which is upholding our obligations to Te Tiriti o Waitangi and making sure we're working alongside the Te Ao Māori perspective of trauma and understanding trauma. So that really intrigued me, and I sort of, started looking at what the Whare o Roro was, and ultimately sort of, read through it. It's been really fascinating for me to look at the understanding of trauma from that holistic point of view, from a community oriented point of view, I would say. And yeah, so I'm really interested and curious, Dr. Dre, where and how did all of this understanding happen? This is the first document I've read that talks about neuroscience through that Te Ao Māori lens. I mean, there might be something else before that, but can you tell us where and how your journey in this space sort of started, and the piece of work that you've done around the whare?
Yeah. So a little bit complicated. So I had difficulties at school, so I was supported to be placed in the community to work in a rest home when I was a teenager, because I had learning difficulties and attentional difficulties and things. So, but I was placed in the kitchen in a psych geriatric hospital, and I was the only tāne in there. So I'm working in the kitchen, deboning, like 20 chickens at a time. So it wasn't like culinary expertise. It was like, don't kill someone by leaving bones in the chicken. So like I did that, but the nurses would come and get me and help to de-escalate a situation which just involved separating 2 chairs. There wasn't, I had no great skill, or lifting. I would help nurses lift, and they employed me. So I was 16 and they moved me from the kitchen to be a psych assistant when I was 16 at a psych geriatric, and I was big and fairly placid, and so I kind of started there, and then I moved to the Community Living Trust when I was 17. I interviewed for a job there and was moving people from Ward K in Tukunui Hospital out into the community. Yeah. So I was 17. That was pretty full on stuff. But I learned young to fake it and just act like I knew what I was doing. I mean, I still do that, but so yeah. So I was moving people out into the community. I was doing that for a while, and I did develop special interest in things. Like I wrote a little booklet on augmentative communication when I was 17, just because it fascinated me about language and those that weren't using language, and moving from the picture of a cup to half a cup, all of those kind of things as a young person really fascinated me. So I worked out with my brain that I liked to take complex things, and in my own mind I have to break them down and pair them and rearrange them, and generally talk through it. So I'm a bit of a verbal processor. So ultimately, I got a job after that working as a youth worker without any qualifications. I just said how I would do things. So I was 20 and I was a youth worker working the Huntly and Ngaruahia issues areas. And at that time I was fighting. So I was doing kickboxing and cage fighting and stuff. So I had a little bit of a reputation in the community, a positive one, not like fighting on the streets. So I kind of built off that, and so I was a youth worker for a while. Started a youth centre in the end called The Hub, which ran for 13 years, which is not something I should do because I have no ability to manage anything. But I I started creating things and explaining things and talking, but it was in my mid-20s or late 20s that I decided to start doing training, and it's there that I learnt how to learn, like in my mid-20s. So I just started doing introduction to university, and in my psychology degree, which all my friends kind of helped me work through, I took an interest in Robert Eisler's paper on neuroscience, and I remember making him a neuron out of Fimo and baking it and giving it to him. It now sounds like a stalker. If any student bakes me something and gives it to me, I will freak out. But I did that in my mid-20s. So I'm pretty sure he still has sleepless nights. But yeah, I just geeked out on that stuff. And yeah, from there, I did a range of studies, Otago University, Waikato in addictions, psychology, and then my PhD. So that's the academic pathway.
Oh my goodness. It amazes me that you started so early. And what I love is that you had the opportunity to do something else because school wasn't working really well, and you were able to really thrive in that space, isn't it? And take off from there. And I think for a lot of our kids, that is missing today because education is so tick box, pigs and sort of squares, and you've got to fit into all of them properly. And if you don't do so, then you end up having that sense of I'm not good enough or we don't belong. And so I really love that you had that opportunity to start off with, in a way that, you felt supported, where you could do things that you enjoyed, and, that supported you to move along the journey. I think that's really amazing. Fabulous.
Yeah, I was really happy to have those opportunities. But I mean, the truth, because I struggle with numbers, and so I was never a psychometrician. Like, I was never doing psychometrics. I'm trained to do it, but I'm a talk therapist. I'm an assessor. The last decade has been in forensics, doing risk assessments, because I kind of look like me, and I'm pretty calm in difficult situations. So I'm pretty chill in that. But then I had, after my 4 children, I went home to an iwi event and was very lucky to spend some time with another child who was at this event with an auntie. And I remember saying at this event, I said, because she's playing with one of my other children, and I was like, I'll take her home with me. And then we had a phone call a couple of weeks later saying, would you like to? And I didn't understand what she meant. And so we whāngaid 2 children from there, and we later learned that they had Te Iho Tātai or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and from there I have gone down deep holes to understand, because for a while there I was teaching at the Otago Medical School, the addictions programs there, and postgraduate, and I taught lectures on fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And then I had children in my house with it, and I didn't know nothing. I was the dumbest person on the planet. Psychology doesn't help, and no one knows. Only other parents know what works and doesn't work. I mean, you can talk to anyone you want, and people, they honestly just don't know. So absolutely, this has been my journey.
Absolutely. I so get it in terms of so my own 3 kids. I've got a fabulous problem solver and a persevering young man, and he is autistic and he is a non-speaker, but he blows me away at how well he communicates, and at one point I thought to myself, as a mother, I don't have to worry about him constantly. I've got to really start enjoying all his positives, his strengths, and he's going to be fine because he finds a way to communicate without any spoken language. And this is even without his device. He'll reference, he'll sort of point, do things. And so I think, yeah, unless you've lived through and you've seen what how our kids can adapt, what they can do, how they sort of manage with the limitations they have sometimes, or the challenges and barriers they face, you don't learn how it can be done, and books don't teach you, isn't it? So
No.
very, very true. I always think I learn with my kids, my 3 boys. They've all got different, unique sort of, abilities, and with each child, I've had to learn. I could never use the same strategies, the same resources, one after the other. It was always different and new. So we learn with our kids. So absolutely true. What has been the journey for you in terms of I guess learning with your children, having all the background, so to speak, your knowledge, your professional knowledge, and that curriculum based sort of understanding as well. How did you integrate the two, and what was that process for you? So I'll tell you why I'm asking you this is because I went down this whole journey of becoming trauma informed, because I felt that I had been going downhill with my own health well-being. I started thinking, because of the constant experiences we had around addiction, at one point I thought, I'm not bouncing back. That's how I thought, I'm not bouncing back. So I thought maybe I'm I've got anxiety. And when I started researching, I started learning out about trauma, and then started learning about developmental trauma and complex trauma and all of that. And I realized that is what I was. And I realized for many, many years, actually, I was in the fight zone, so to speak, because that's what I was doing, advocating all the time. And I realized I had moved on from that flight zone to the freeze zone, and I was starting to dissociate. And that really scared me, So that started me off. When I started it off, I started learning also not just to support myself, but how to support my children, managing their meltdowns, and how do I support them through that. And while I've got all the knowledge and I can do it better, there are still times when I struggle, and there are still times when I think I need to learn more, I need to do more. So, that integration of the knowledge and understanding you gain, and then the practice, actually putting it into practice, that takes, quite a bit. So what has that been like for you? Taking all of it and integrating it and putting it into practice in your home with your family. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, well, I'm really fortunate because my wife's a teacher, Sarah Jane is, and we were both youth workers back in the day. We literally got together when we started this youth centre, and she's a half of me that I don't have, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But and my children, so my children are beautiful. All 6 of them are beautiful. So when my 2 came, they fitted either side of our youngest Te Ahuru o Te Rangi. So my son came, he was 8 months old, and his sister was 4.5. And in between them, there was a 2-year-old. And they've grown up together. And then I've got a middle child and 2 older children. So they're 20 down to 8. And they are kind of paired off in growing up. So yes, have to be parents, have to make decisions. But in Te Ao Māori, the teina tuakana relationships is so special and so important. Like, you can growl one of them and the other one will defend them, and then the other times they will knock on each other. And it's like there's an internal system. And I couldn't do that without my other children. I couldn't bring up my children without that. So that hasn't been overly difficult. Yeah. There is a thing about being a parent with children with disabilities where people look at you like a shit parent, because your kids are doing random stuff on a regular basis. Yeah. I mean, I'm pretty good with that now. I think that's been hard for my wife. Like, if you're in the community and a school teacher, people are like, oh, your kids are doing this, they're running across the road, there's violence, there's whatever. And I mean, I'm just like, I don't care. But I have my own way of dealing with the world. So I think that is hard on parents, because parenting is hard with a neurotypical child. Do you know what I mean? Parenting a child who is kind of not vibing within themselves and with the world around them is an additional challenge. So I've learned to tune into my children. I've learned to tune into what's happening around, obviously tuning into myself, because, I also now try not to understand everything. Do you know what I mean? I mean, you can do your head in, trying to rationally understand something and trying to get from them why they did something when they don't know why they did something random.
Yes.
I'm just like, we're just kicking into tomorrow. So I try not to hold the taki too long because it makes you sick. I mean, it's so complex. The human brain is so complex, and when we understand how that relates to neurodevelopment, that makes it a bit easier. So when we talk about being, neurodevelopmentally informed and trauma informed, it is understanding a little bit where some of these things come from. They don't come from an intentional place. We're often talking about can't versus won't. This child won't do something. I'm like, probably can't do something. And then they're like, oh, well, they could do it yesterday. And I'm like, well, the stars didn't align today. You know, the brain fires from the bottom to the front. And if there's anything happening, they're hungry, they're oversensitive to something, the usual glimmer or safe thing or person is not there, they're not going to be firing that day. And so I try in the work that I do to help people understand neurodevelopment and communication across the brain in a way that we can re-look at behavior and we can re-look at how our children are developing.
I love what you've mentioned about not trying to understand everything. I must say, when I first started my journey with my kids, I was always wanting to know everything in terms of, but why? And I thought if I understand them better, then I can do better to support them. And I did eventually reach that stage where I thought, I'm not always going to know why, and I'm not always going to make a proper informed guess. My guesses could be wrong because I've got 2 children who do not speak. One does not speak at all, but he'll use a lot of vocalizations, my 19-year-old. And then my second son, who has an intellectual disability. And he has, I call him a total communicator. So he uses a few words, few signs, a device, and lots of drama and flair. And so he's my social child with very few social skills. And he does things and I used to keep trying to understand, why is he doing, what is he doing, how do I respond? But I think I've now learned, that in the moment, what I need to respond to is to ensure he is well regulated, he's feeling good, doesn't matter why he got upset. How do I get him back into that space of feeling good, feeling safe, feeling comfortable where he is. So I think I've learned that because as parents we can't always know every little bit about our kids, what's triggering and what's happening. You can do your best, but you can't always know.
And they don't know.
Yes, that's so
we have this thing that our children know and they're not telling us.
Yes, that is so true. That is so true. And I think it's a little for us as well, isn't it? We feel off, and unless we really take the time to dig in, we don't understand why or what exactly, all those layers are. And underneath those layers, what sort of, started us sort of feeling agitated. And I love that we are now talking through all this work that's happening around, the polyvagal theory and, the focus on co-regulation, that we are now starting to shift the focus from digging into why things are happening or what has triggered us off into actually let's look at how do we get ourselves back on with that body up approach. Because with the top down you had to dig down and find out what was going on and then sort of shift, whereas now without the digging you can shift. And I think it's so useful, isn't it, especially for people who don't want to talk or who don't want to spend time digging down and doing that talk therapy or talking about what has affected them in a negative way. So no, that's really interesting. Look, my next question is, how have you personally integrated the whole Western worldview of trauma and neuroscience that you sort of, learned and started off with the whole Te Ao Māori kaupapa and approach of understanding trauma, healing trauma? Where and how did that sort of happen? And where did your learning in that Te Ao Māori space sort of come from?
Yeah, I think that's really, there's several layers in that. I think for myself, re-engaging with my own people, I remember, you know, I did some random stuff back in the day as a youth worker. I mean, we connected 2 PlayStations to the side of a van with a power converter, and we would drive around between midnight and 5 a.m. in the morning, and we would take food with us, and we would drive into town. We would stop, or in the community, past kids would stop. We'd open the side, turn the games on, and you know, rangatahi and tamariki would come to us.
Wow.
We'd play a game with them standing on the outside of this van, and we would give them food. So we did that for years. You know, Mike Rarere and my wife Sarah Jane and my friends. We had ministers come out with us over the night, and that led to us being invited to go over to the United Nations and present. It was called Contact Street Support at the time, because it was about how we approached young people in high-risk situations without actually approaching them. They always came to us. We would always drive past them and set up, and they would come to us. And so we did that, and we got to go to the UN. And when I'm going overseas, and I'm like, I don't know myself well enough. And this is really common too. You know, you want to know yourself when you go overseas. So I contacted a cousin, and at the time he was like on the Chatham Islands, and he connected me with his dad. So I went and saw his dad, Matua Joe, and he took me around back home. And from there, they just kept bringing me back. And I was really lucky. My cousin wrote the treaty settlement research for our iwi as a young man, and he's a really deeply knowledgeable person. And we're really connected. He loves his children. Grant loves his boys, and he's very close to them. We're very similar in nature. So I've just had this loving relationship with my iwi where I'm invited and looked after, and I come back and I share my knowledge, and I work on the research team back home, and have done mahi like we did the review of Lake Alice recently for the iwi report for the government abuse and state care work. So I'm really fortunate, and I think this is a thing within Te Ao Māori. We all have a place in the community, in the marae, and same with our children with special needs. There are so many things that they can contribute to. So my development has been since, I think I went back in 2000. I went overseas, so I started that relationship, and I've become quite heavily involved back home, and did my PhD back home. So that was really cool. So the Te Ao Māori development has happened in that line, but the Te Ao Māori and the neuroscience, it's just that I have a particular interest in things, and I get lost in those things. So I have autism, and I have ADHD, and so I tend to go deep into things, and then deep sideways, and I get lost. So with the neuroscience, it has always fascinated me. However, anything I look at, I'll look at through a Te Ao Māori lens, which is through stories. So it's like metaphors or stories. So if I'm listening to something, so I was at Whatawhata Marae at Papaorotu on the weekend, right? And Thursday and Friday, and I was sharing about glial cells. So glial are the kaitiaki for growing and expanding cells and things like that. Most of the conditions, fetal alcohol, things like that, impact on the system that looks after our brain. But for me to understand it, I had to understand that there was I had to understand when in the creation of the brain that these glial cells got involved. So there was this mai te pō ki te ao marama process where there's this unfolding of these neural tubes, and then there's this radiating type of cell, and glial is like, it's Greek for glue. So within Te Ao Māori, mauri is the glue between the ira and the ira tangata. So we've got this substance that is literally, mauri is the life force, ma uri. So ma being light and energy, and uri is like progeny, procreation. So for me, when I'm listening, there's these glue cells, I'm like, okay, a little bit like mauri. And you've got this, about 5 weeks into gestation, you've got this radiating growth and scaffolding out of these neurons. And for me, I can hear the rhythmic nature of this scaffolding and taking form, and that radiating is the radial glia, and it's a stem cell. So for me, I'm thinking radiation, radiating out, and I understand from the radial glial comes these very fine little cells called microglial, and they are like the dust of the universe. So it goes out there. So in my head, I'm seeing this, and then it starts to take form. And what those microglial do is they create the blood-brain barrier. And so in my head, I can see this happening, and then I understand that we've got the astrocytes, which are star-shaped, which do most of the work in the brain, glial cells. So immediately I think about these star-shaped, and I think about Ngā Whetū o Tāwhiri Mātia, when he ripped his eyes out and he threw them up into the sky. So you've got these, and then you've got these manu that go out into the body. So all of the cells, we have neurons out in our body that grow and adapt, and these manu are called swan cells. And they're not swan cells, they're schwann cells. But in my head, they're manu, and they're flying down to earth. And that's the separation of rangi and papa. So in my head, when I'm hearing things, I'm attaching it to a framework of understanding of the creation of the universe, but within the headspace. And I think it's just being an oral, you know, kind of an oral language, oral traditions within us, pūrākau and pakiwaitara and waiata and these things, pull these concepts together and we match and overlap them. So yeah, so for me, the Te Ao Māori thing is I'm learning and listening, and I'm placing it in my world, and I do that with most of my work. But that's also the way my brain operates.
That is amazing, absolutely fascinating, Andre. When I was reading Te Whare Oro, I was just thinking to myself, when I first learned about polyvagal theory, I had to really remember which was which, you know, ventral vagal, dorsal vagal, and it was really hard for me to remember. And then I was reading everything, and I was thinking how much easier it is when you are, you know, making sense of the neuroscience or any technical sort of, you know, information in context to something that you understand. And for you, it's the purakau and, you know, all of your cultural sort of knowledge that helps you make sense. And I was just thinking, I was like, how do I make sense? You know, what do I find that's going to help me make sense? So it's really fascinating how you describe, you know, your understanding and how you take it across that Western worldview into the Te Ao Māori space, and you know.
Yeah, and I think the other thing though is we have our own way of understanding things like energy, communication, and connection. So in some ways, when I learn, and I want to call it international science as opposed to Western science, because you know, science doesn't just come from the West whānau. So the international science that we come in and that we learn about from all around the world is often quite intricate and disconnected. And I'm fascinated, love that stuff. But you can talk to a psychologist who won't know about biology, who won't know about plant cell structure, but within Te Ao Māori, those things are one. So you know, when I learned psychology, I would look at someone and I would be thinking, okay, that's not a mental health disorder because it's been happening for a long time. I'm looking personality disorder. Man, I looked at myself when I went through training and I'm like, oh shit, I'm a bit narcissistic. Like, because I've got a thing with authority. Like if someone's in authority, but they say dumb stuff, I'm like, that makes no sense to me. But I understand now that's a strong part of autism around justice and social justice, and also not getting the hierarchies and stuff. But for me, that's yeah, I've only learnt that, kind of learnt that over time. But I do understand that when we have our own knowledge, so sometimes international knowledge just kind of reinforces our current knowing. If you look at this, right, we talk about the maramataka. So the maramataka being the moon phases and the reading the tohu within yourself, within Ngā Whetū, within the moon, within animals, within nature. Right? So we do this, and people are like, oh my God, that's not science. And I'm like, okay, because science is observational over time and guides our behavior, right? However, you know, international biology will talk about circadian rhythms, which is part of the, you know, superchiasmatic nucleus in the hippocampus, and there are 50,000 neurons. Like, yeah, cool, love that, know that. And that's the part of the brain that distributes energy based on the area of the dark and light where things are, but also across seasons, depending on food availability and stuff like that. So there is part of the brain which is about distributing energy, and it interacts with hormones, and there are longer and shorter types of rhythms. So I'm like, okay, so you guys can talk about there being a clock, and you guys can talk about this rhythms, and then there's like brain waves, these theta waves, gamma waves, you know, alpha waves, how the brain communicates. And we're like, okay, love that. We talk about modi, and we talk about the flow across all living things, and how modi affects us and how we affect the modi of different things. We have names for states of modi which are an elevated state. So you're going from tau to oho to rere, and also, you know, coming from down from tau to noho to modi moi. We have a language and an understanding of these phases, which help us understand our level of energy, our connection with the environment, and how to manage our health. So all of this stuff that we pick up around circadian rhythms, brain waves, it's like, yeah, we have those compartments in our understanding of how we look at each other, our relationship with the environment, because how we view health and how we view well-being. Yet I never learned in psychology around biology and circadian rhythms. Like, I understand now more about psychopharmacology because I look at biology. You know, you look at sodium valproate for bipolar disorder, that actually works on lengthening the circadian rhythm because that is impacted in bipolar disorder, and, you know, ADHD and some other things. So this thing between international science and Māori science, or mā tauranga Māori, in some ways I bring in what I learn, and other ways it's just like, oh yeah, we have a more complete language and understanding of those disparate parts in a way that guides our day-to-day behavior. So that's kind of how I look at those two lenses.
And I think it's one feeding the other, isn't it? You've got something here and this new knowledge feeds it, and then you might have something here already, and, you know, the new knowledge or understanding as you connect better, you know, with your whakapapa and the Te Ao Māori sort of space, that sort of, you know, adds to it. That's really amazing. One of the things that I have really appreciated is I guess the collective understanding, or the collective pathway through which, you know, trauma can happen for someone, or, you know, be experienced by someone, and also that collective community oriented pathway through which trauma can be healed. And so when I started looking at trauma and I started trying to understand what is it that I have experienced, is it you know, developmental trauma, but at a certain phase of life, although developmental, you know, is supposed to be in the early years. Is it actually complex trauma because of, you know, the experiences of discrimination we've had ongoing? And then I started peeling back and I started thinking, actually, there's also systemic trauma that we've experienced, you know, with the systems and processes. Every time you have to talk to a professional and ask for resources, or, you know, every time you have to comply and fit into a certain box in order to get something or access something, you know, the labels, all of these things, you know, there's lots of that systemic sort of trauma that comes through. And then there's that collective trauma when there are decisions made. Recently, you know, there were decisions made around changes to the purchasing guidelines for disability funding. And that really, really caused, I could see the trauma in the community. We could feel it, all of us, you know. And there's that collective trauma. And it's almost like you have to label all these different traumas you're experiencing or something. Whereas when you're looking at it through that Te Ao Māori lens, you acknowledge all of it, and you look at, you know, where what the environment is doing to cause it and stuff like that. Talk to us a bit more about that, Andre. I would love to hear from your perspective. you know, when we try and understand trauma from the Te Ao Māori lens, what is it like when we try and understand the brain and the nervous system, you know, how experiences affect our brain and nervous system and cause trauma through the Te Ao Māori lens? What's that like?
Oh, well, Kapa, there's a few different ways to talk about that. So I'll go across to, you know, collective trauma and the understanding of trauma, because it's really complicated and difficult to heal trauma while people are still being hurt.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the trauma, you know, the ongoing trauma at the moment around consistent attacks on our language, you know, our visibility being removed and literally whitewashed, that is trauma because it's linked with a lineage of trauma of our people. So it's not, we're not talking, when we talk intergenerational trauma, we're not talking historical trauma about stuff that happened. Colonization's an ongoing process of power and demeaning and these things that happen. And even my tamariki pick up on this and ask me questions about it. So to heal trauma, we need to make someone safe. We need to protect the things that make them whole and that they hold pride in. And we have done work in that over the last generations, but we're doing a quick backtrack now. So when I look at intergenerational trauma, I understand that Mātauranga Māori held our understanding of well-being, prosperity, roles, love, life, you know, all of these things, whakapuawai, to flourish. And that held how we interacted with the world. Colonization started breaking apart our knowing and our systems. And that brought in things like disease and violence and broke down our whānau structure. So all of these things started breaking down. What maintains that is, you know, racism is one of the big ongoing stresses. Because if you think about your whole stress response system that's activated within trauma, if you're being followed around a shop every time you go to a shop, that's trauma. Your system is going, you are not safe, you cannot settle. So we've got all of these traumas that build. If you look at adverse childhood events or the extended ACEs, not the basic Western kind of 10, but the extended ACEs that also look at community trauma that is spoken much more about, that really talks about the impact of poverty on our stress response system, on mamas, on relationships, family systems, and on the child. So you've got that, you know, any trauma, you're more likely to experience further trauma. So intergenerational trauma becomes a systemic and biological, if you think of epigenetics. So it becomes a process that just keeps winding up. So one part talking about intergenerational trauma is acknowledging that it's an ongoing systemic and biological process. How we deal with that, like in the clinical room, like I enjoyed working in the community when I was younger, but there was too much for me. I had to deal with too many people. So I had to, the effort for me in dealing with someone is quite a lot. I get quite tired because I have to consciously map out everything I do, and that's part of my autism. I'm just it's a lot for me anyway. So I moved back a little bit and did focused on my clinical work. So there has to be community grounded interventions around trauma. So I do like the things that we do back home. We do tamariki taiao things, getting children into the environment. We address things around like Lake Alice and the ongoing impact of Lake Alice. So we address that trauma at a collective level, but that's more guided by like Auntie Cheryl Smith and people like that who have those abilities, that knowing to engage with the community. For me, within the therapy space, from a Māori perspective, it is not using these labels around, you know, PTSD, complex trauma, all of those things. If I take a neuroscience perspective within Mātauranga Māori, I'm talking about the flow of their modi, which is their connection to their life force, the thing that keeps them in contact with others and with their environment where they get nourishment from. And I can talk about the stress response system and the rest and digest system in relation to the more active we get, we become more oho. So we have a lift in energy, but that costs us. You know, when we engage in the world, that's a cost, you know, that drains some Māori from us. If we get stuck in oho, in this awoken space and active, and we don't come back to tau, we can go into Māori rere, which is kind of it's a really distressing form of kind of being out of control and out of touch. I often talk about it as oho is the sun, but rere is flying into the sun and getting burnt. If you think about us as practitioners, if we don't cut back our work, we get burnt out. Yeah. So from a perspective of trauma, I talk about someone's kind of stress response being their level of tau, because sometimes someone has been so traumatized and continues to be traumatized that their tau is oho, and anytime anything happens, you know, they're in rere really quickly, really quick response. So from a neurodevelopmental perspective, some of our tamariki, by the time they get to school, they've had to map out brushing their teeth, map out what order their clothes go in, like the amount of cognitive energy. So when you think you're dragging glucose in from your bloodstream, right? You are burning energy. So someone with autism, you know, the brain is working at rest 44% harder, and not having really helpful thoughts. It's just picking up every sensation. It's just working because it hasn't been pruned. Those kaitiake, you know, in the brain, those astrocytes, those star glials, haven't been pruning. So we don't have a reduced brain size. It's actually hasn't been tidied up. So it's a thicket as opposed to a nice tidy garden that we can walk around and get stuff and pass stuff around. So I talk about that thing about being rere, and for some children, from a neurodevelopmental perspective, they're already elevated because an hour in the day of having to think and plan, because a child who has a really tidy garden, it's all fine-tuned, they don't have to think about all the things they do. They are muscle memory and they're a knowing. For a child with a neurodevelopmental challenge, often everything is planned, even a conversation, even us saying hello and what might come back is exhausting. So I can look at treatment and trauma in that way, and I can also look at things like how you use moi, whether you know, to be able to rest, because rest and digest, if your system doesn't wind down, rest and digest from a polyvagal perspective is where we rest, our cells nourish. From a brain perspective, those astrocytes, that's where they do all of the tidying up and getting rid of the toxins from the brain. So there's all these things that need to happen when we sleep. And often if you've experienced trauma or you're under stress, we don't sleep as well. And this is the thing around Māori. From a Māori academic perspective, it is not referencing Bruce Perry. He's a cool dude, by the way, though. It is referencing our pūrākau. Like, everything has to have a logical trail for us to either kind of not just understand it, but accept that. I mean, the thing about light and dark for us is very much, from a religious perspective, often light and dark is seen as like good and evil and stuff like this. And from Te Ao Māori, it's not. I mean, the separation of rangi and papa, you know, that separation, darkness wasn't a bad place. They made 70 kids. It wasn't a non-productive place either. Darkness is very productive space, but it wasn't enough. So it wasn't just about light, it was light and water. So these things came with the separation of rangi and papa. But you can go across to Maui. I mean, Maui knew that we needed more sun, but he didn't capture the sun and keep the sun up there all day. It was connected to hina, so we could have balance of light and day. So this movement around Māori is very natural in all of our pūrākau around balance, balance and harmony. So when I talk to someone about using noho, that's a good space. Like, oh, the sun is a good space to be in, getting stuff done. So is noho. It's when we get stuck, like, and we no longer step forward into tau, like if we get stuck in noho and that becomes our new tau, our new central point, that's where depression and things like that come in. So, yeah, Dr. Waikari Moana Waituki, who is floating around the world somewhere. She was in Prague last week, and I'm not kidding you, she's in New York. I'm only saying that because if she sees this, I'm trying to make her feel guilty because I want help with stuff, because she is the bomb at getting stuff done. But she talked about the Moriora Taipari. So those three central around tau, oho, and noho, it is the taipari is just the flow through those states. And if we can help people understand what is your tau, what is your noho and how do you use it, what is your oho and how do you use it, we can flow and vibe with the world around us. And have you been stuck before, or have you been lost before? What are the things that lead to that? What changes do we have to make? All of those types of things. So from a practicing within trauma within the Te Ao Māori perspective is utilizing our concepts which connect someone more to a natural process than a diagnosis and a label and some additional thing to do. I see cognitive errors and thoughts and random stuff like that as as a ripple that comes out from this modi. So if you think about what we talked about earlier around our tamariki, I try and kind of see where someone's modi is and what they need first before I try and do that rational stuff. Yeah. So sorry, that is a long-winded kind of wānanga, but
no,
that's me.
I absolutely love how you said, you know, tau oho and noho are continually sort of in flow, and it's okay to, you know, move between. One of the things I've realized is I am very comfortable now. For a while I've been actually, in terms of just accepting when there's a meltdown. It's happening. It's okay. You know, give space and hold space for that to happen, and rather than rush it and sort of try and stop it. So I think that's one thing I've learned really well with my kids. The thing I do still struggle with is how do you do it with adults? Because mentally, you know, you are sort of you're programmed to think that as adults or as professionals or, you know, grown-ups, we have to behave in a proper way and this and that. And I think that's the shift that I'm trying to think about, you know, creating space for others as well, adults as well. We are a really neurodivergent family. So we've got the 3 boys. I've got a husband who's neurodivergent. And so at times, you know, I feel like I can do better by my children than by my husband. But it's again something I'm learning, that it's okay, all the states are fine, and you know it's different and you're flowing across the states, and one is not, it's not about being good or bad, it's about in the moment what is needed, you know, to then move back. And
it's natural. We're talking about our flow, and all of our flows are slightly different. You know, we use the whare metaphor to understand that, you know, Te Whare Oro talks about the structure of the brain, and that's, you know, we spend quite some time, because one of the things within Te Ao Māori being an oral tradition is the use of kupu whakarite, which is a metaphor basically. So if you work with someone to help someone understand something, if you're working from a shared metaphor, they have something to hang new knowledge on.
Yes.
However, if I come and talk to someone and talk about the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the mesocortical limbic system, they're like, there's nothing for that to hang on. You know, it just falls to the floor. If I talk about the central nervous system of a whare tupuna being the roro going along the tāhuhu of the whare, someone knows, if that's a shared metaphor, that is the spine and the brain of the whare, that everything comes off and all knowledge goes back into, is the tāhuhu of the whare. And from that, I talk about the 4 po that hold up the whare, being the 4 areas of the brain. But we have traditional understandings of each po, of an inside of a whare, and you can just, the thing, when you use a metaphor and you introduce knowledge to it, so, you know, I run 2 wānanga over the last 2 weeks. You use the metaphor, you koha what you have, and the wānanga digs deep in its own metaphor for guidance. The first time I ever talked about the whare was when my youngest was going across to school in Whatawhata, and I'm like, because he'd had a minder, they had a one-on-one at daycare, because there was a lot of violence from about the age of 4 leading up to 5. So I had to go to kura, and and he was going into a ruareo, and I had to explain where he was and how to communicate with him. And these teachers were Māori, so it's cool. It's like, okay, how do I get this across? And I'm like, okay, so my boy, when he's playing with something and he leaves it and someone else comes and plays with that thing, for him, it's still his. Do you know what I mean? And he's going to get really upset by that. So he's still learning and developing his sense of connection and trust and understanding of time and sharing and all of these things, neurodevelopmentally. Yeah. So what I said is, if you go to him and get him to explain himself, he is going to run to the back of the whare. So the whare, a whare tupuna, the back of the whare is the darkest, coldest, but generally the quietest place. It is the place where the po tuarongo stands, which is where our senses are. That is where, you listen to the pūrākau from, Matua Mark Korpua talks about Rongo stood when the 3 baskets of knowledge were brought into wharekura. So it's a very important part of the whare. He will run there, and that is the back part of his brain. So he is fight or flight, but he is getting away. If you're wanting to converse with him why he feels that way, why he did what he did, you're at the po kai awha. The po kai awha is the whare outside of the po outside of the whare that holds up the maho. And that is the frontal cortex. And it's often, in our stories, it's often a leader. It's called a po kai awha because it is the po that eats the winds, and for us, tāwhiri mātia is the wind. So that is the po that deals with the outside world. So I said, when you're there, and he's at the back of the whare, it just looks like you're yelling at him. He is not working from that space. So I started with that metaphor, and then it was the kaiako, Lamoni and Matua, William Olsen, and they were like, oh, so how do we move them along the po? And then we start talking about po, co-regulation, and we talk about the po tahu being tāne's po, which is all about our physical senses, because it's, to the left of the door where the light comes in, and is higher than the back, and it's separated onion papa. So it's all about, physical abilities and movement, and the po kai awha being our limbic system. So we talked about addressing the po tuarongo, which is our breathing and our heart rate and things like that, and the po tahu to meet at the po kai awha. And the po kai awha being our limbic system is the tohu of what our needs are. So it's in the form of an emotion, but it's also where we connect with others. So, and that's all in the space of rongo. So rongo is around peace, and it's our ngākau, which is our inner self. So we talk quite a lot about dealing with someone's ngākau and their sensations and senses before trying to get rational about shit. Tell me why, when did it happen? And it's like, hey, it might be 2 hours later that you sit at the maho in the sun and reflect on what happened, or you might wait till the next day. But as you said all the way at the start, you focus on regulation first. So it is about getting someone in a place where their mana is intact, they're safe, they're de-escalating, and in a place, and maybe it's just to sit at the po kai awha for the rest of that day, at a place where they can connect with people and feel safe. And, all of the wānanga we're having now is, what are the actions that we have within Te Ao Māori for regulating our brain stem, our diencephalon cerebellum, which is our movement and sensations, and our limbic system to open up for learning. And that's exciting for me, because there are so many different things that we can do.
Yes. And things like we talk about the rhythm, the repetition, all of that really sort of helping out with the regulation. And there's so much that can be done in terms of the waiata, the sort of little games that you can play, movements that you can do that help and allow. But I think it's really important to note, unless the adult is willing to get into that emotional state of compassion, I like to call it. Without the compassion, you can't really connect with our kids when they're sort of in that state of distress and dysregulation. So it's so important. We have to bring ourselves into that space, into that emotional space of compassion, and allow that safety to be felt, and only then can they sort of connect. And it reminds me, there's so many things we do you know, as I've been learning and, you know, you've been talking and stuff, we sometimes connect with people who don't even speak the same language, isn't it? You sometimes meet a stranger who speaks a totally different language, or, you know, they come from a totally different perspective, but you connect. And it's almost because you're at that same sort of emotional nervous system, you know, wavelength, so to speak, the energy matches. And so you hold space for each other, you know, you connect. So yeah, it's really, really interesting, coming to that central pole and sort of meeting over there, connecting, holding space, and then looking at, you know, the rationale, the logic, and, you know, making sense of things. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's so much you can talk about from a neuroscience perspective, or from a Mātauranga Māori perspective, the space of rongo and the ngākau. So the term for a traumatic event or trauma is a patu ngākau, so it's a strike to the ngākau. But how we experience patu ngākau around riri, around pauri, all of these things, mamai, all of these physical sensations, that often is reflected to the internal perspective of someone. But you can take that neuroscience perspective and say, when someone is in the central parts of their brain, there's no time there. There is no understanding of time, future, or consequences, which is the front part of the brain. So you can say all of the consequences and punishments that you might do, but when someone's at the back of the brain, that means jack.
Yeah.
And the other thing is they're not processing words. The back of the brain is quicker, so they're picking up your tone, your pitch, your body language, your eyes, everything that talks about risk. So if you are panting and looking over them and going, it's okay, they're like, nah, it's not okay because you're not okay.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
Science tells us that. So we try and talk, I think when we wānanga around these things, it's so important that we just talk about the realities of what we face and we experience, and help people understand it, empathize with themselves, because we do dumb shit all the time as adults, and we have to go back, reflect on it, and change how we do things. But also empathize the process our tamariki go through. Like each and every day. I'm so impressed with my children because of what they have to go through to make it through the day and learn new things and do things. My girl who's doing poi, she's now doing poi both hands, and that's taken years. But that is literally neurodevelopment for her, bringing together the basic parts of the brain and reaction without thought. So areas that have been impacted by alcohol, that is a therapeutic process. And there's more evidence around things like that now that's coming to the fore, which is really exciting for us.
That's fabulous. Look, this has been really, really interesting. I've got a couple more questions to go. What do you think, you know, in terms of, what would you say the strengths or the alignment is, that works really well between the Western or international sort of, you know, perspectives that are coming through, and Te Ao Māori perspectives? What's gelling well, working well, and what is not working well, what is not aligning well? And the other thing is, and this is a follow-on question, Andre, what can we be doing? And I'm talking about not necessarily Maori professionals, but for tangata tiriti, what can we be doing to support this mahi? I know within NATINA, we are really keen and passionate to make sure that we hold space, or that we make sure we're working in alignment with, you know, the Te Ao Māori kaupapa as well. So what can we be doing in that space? Yeah. Because this is a new space for me. I'll totally admit it. You know, for me, the mahi started only because of my own personal experiences, and when I started realizing individuals were already doing stuff, I just wanted it to be amplified, and I wanted to be, you know, moving along the momentum to pick up, so that we have more of this happening across the country. So, what can we be doing in this space?
There's a couple of questions in there. Things don't have to align. That's one of the things to think about We don't have to cross things over as well. Holding space, which is really good. I love when you're saying that, is giving someone the space to delve into their own knowledge system and bring forward with pride what we do well, and to learn from that, because we are going to respond to those ways of knowing in a much more heartfelt, committed way when it comes from us. So that's one side. Holding space is a beautiful thing, and giving voice so we can talk through that. I think when we do look at crossing over, I think Te Ao Māori is going to provide a more comprehensive way of looking at things, which is more integrated, as opposed to the kind of the different parts that are spread out across biology, soil science, astrology, all of these complex. And they, I meet anyone who is a tohunga in their own mātauranga. I love that. But I think our frameworks flow because they're about natural flow, but they are deep. They are in our stories. They are in our understanding, our ongoing, if you think of the maramataka, our ongoing observation of change in the environment within us. So I think Māori offer a way of bringing different disparate worlds together for well-being. So that's kind of how I view it. And
I love it.
I probably couldn't understand, I probably couldn't tell you what you need to do from a tangata tiriti led. But I think reflecting on ourselves and whether we do hold space and create space, and because we're in a really difficult time now where our voice and our mātauranga is being whitewashed and ignored and overlooked. And I know when a service will say, look, we're looking at meeting the needs of Māori and non-Māori. We can do both. I'm like, just bro, stay in your lane, do your thing, be you. You don't have to be everything for everyone, because all that's happening is certain groups are going, look, they can work with Māori and non-Māori. And I'm like, really? So yeah, I just have a heart for that. I mean, we need to keep, and we have, there are people out there, Linda Smith and Waikari Moana Waituki and Hukarere Valentine and Tanya Cargo and Ainsley Cribb and Rebecca Wirihana and Dr. Talia Kingi and Horiana Jones and Pari Wahika Harris. All of these people are extending the field of mātauranga Māori within practice. And we might, in some ways, be overlooked for people that are meeting the needs of different perspectives at the moment. Shit like boot camps and stuff that has no science. Anyway, I won't go too far down that, but holding space to allow us to keep promoting and understanding our own knowledge and how that applies to ourselves is a really cool place to start.
That's awesome. Look, thank you so much for that. Is there anything else you wanted to share with us in terms of the work you're doing, or any key messages you have for families, professionals, working especially with neurodivergent tamariki and rangatahi,
I think we've got to grow and keep learning and keep understanding, and particularly within the mental health space, we tend to look through a mental health lens, which is DSM based, which is criteria, without actually looking at someone's abilities. The big thing with Matua Manu Kawana giving the name Te Iho Tātai a Rongo, it was about, we didn't like the FASD name. There was even a Māori name put forward for FASD, which did involve some feedback from a FASD caregiver, but it was, being patu'd by alcohol, basically. And it's like, well, that's not the diagnosis my children will hold for their life. Thank you very much. My children are not a public health message. Te Iho Tātai a Rongo are the gifts handed down. And for my children, I not only see FASD, I see all of those gifts and the places they have in the world. And I think we have to remember that with neurodiversities, all of our, as with myself, I have things to give, but I'm shit, I couldn't change a tire. We all have our place. We all have the things that we can do. So we need to be able, when we look at our children, we need to still give them opportunities and space to be what they're going to be and acknowledge their mana and their tapu and things like this should drive our decisions. So that's probably the last thing I would put out there is for parents who have children with differences, it's really important that you learn from the wisdom of other parents and don't lose touch of the beautiful things, because the painful things, if we hold them and carry them to the next day, they're just hurting us. Often our kids let that stuff go overnight. It's us that hold that. And we start the day off and we remind them about the shit that happened last night. You know, so you start your day off like that. So, you know, some things to take on as parents about that.
I spent a lot of years initially, so because she was 19 now, I spent probably the first 10, 11 years of his life really worrying. So I always valued him, you know, all my kids appreciated them, all of that. But one thing I didn't let go of was the worry and that concern of, you know, what's going to happen and all of that. And I didn't realize how much that was holding me back from really enjoying fully or engaging fully, you know, with life. And I think once I let go of it, I really felt different in terms of how I was bringing myself, how I was, you know, looking at the future, at you know, the present, sort of engaging. So I think that's so important, not holding on to stuff, and you know, every day is a new beginning. So yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Look, what I'm gonna quickly wrap us up. Just a few things that I wanted to share before I press pause on our recording, and then we can just open up to the floor and we can take questions from people. So just want to let our viewers know, everybody who's here today, this is just voluntary work I do, and I'm not very good at admin. So what I've done is added everybody who RSVP'd onto our Korero list, and which just keeps getting copy pasted to the next month. So I will do the same for the next Korero, but please feel free to, if you want to be taken off the monthly Korero, just, you know, email me and let me know, and I'll sort of do that until I figure out a more sophisticated way of sort of, you know, doing the admin work. This is how it's going to be done. So we've got the next event that we have coming up, which is for 10th August. It's a yoga education in schools event run by Andrew Rubber. It's an interactive sort of session. So we get to practice some breath work and some movement activities. And then we've got 14th August, our next Korero, monthly Korero that will be happening with two fabulous wahine, Vanessa White and Sarah Warren, and both are parents of neurodivergent children who've actually experienced educational trauma. And so they're going to be talking about sort of their journey. And Vanessa White is also a professor and lecturer, at University of Canterbury around teaching the specialist teaching for gifted children program. So yeah, so that's our next Korero. And then we every 2 months we have a NATINA Ropu network hui. So this is just people come together, and it's, you know, their space to sort of talk, connect about, you know, what's happening, what's going on, just sharing, asking questions, all that kind of stuff with each other, really. So if anybody wants to join that, you're welcome to. That is on the 28th of August. I will not be using the same list for the network hui. So if you do want to join up for that, do let me know, and I can add you to it. But look, other than that, what I will do is I will just wrap us off with a karakia just for our recording, so we get it all together, and then we will hang around and we can answer questions that you might have. Okay, so thank you, Andre, for coming along. Really, really do appreciate it. This has been such a fabulous Korero. Loved having you along. Thanks a lot. And thanks for the mahi you do. And the way you encourage people to look at our children, our takiwatanga, our, you know, aroretini. And I haven't got the term right now for our fast children, but I will make sure I learn that properly. The Te Reo term. But yeah, it's really important that we start shifting the way we see our kids. We've got to see them as the gifts that they bring to us, and you know, the learning and growing we do with them is really important to cherish. So thank you for today. Karakia whakamutunga. Kia whakairia te tapu, kia wātia ai te ara, kia turuki whakataha ai, kia turuki whakataha ai. Haumi e, hui e, taiki e. All right, I'm gonna stop right